So I don't really know who this guy is. Some guy, Big Joel, doesn't look so big. He made some video attacking Peterson. I'm just gonna go through it, see what he says, and give my reaction.
About YouTube conservatism. This time we're talking about Jordan Peterson. And just as a disclaimer, if you're a fan of Peterson's who's bothered by the fact that I've categorized him as a conservative, I really wouldn't worry about it too much. I'll explain more in a footnote that I've written, but I really wouldn't worry about it. Just take a walk on the wild side, entertain a Big Joel video. And with that, let's get started. So when I was in my first semester of college, I read T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land in an introductory English class. While the poem is renowned for being complicated, filled with allusions to canonical works, different languages, archetypal figures, pretentious stuff like that, I think the basic story Eliot tells is a simple one. The world around us is a wasteland. In the wake of World War I, and under the crushing weight of modernity, we have found ourselves fragmented and without moral center.
What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images.
As the poem progresses, we navigate this world. One fixated on image, but image without substance. We have taken the narratives that give our lives meaning and purpose and replaced them with easily consumable trash.
Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But oh, that Shakespearean rag, it's so elegant, so intelligent.
There is no water here, no spiritual sustenance, no way to create meaning. It's a wasteland. So naturally, we're left with a question. How do we get out of it? And the answer Eliot gives is, we have to fix ourselves. See, this poem is, at its core, a Fisher King narrative from Arthurian legend. The kingdom is in disrepair because the king is injured. And to become well again, to make the world well again, the king must hear the right words. In this case, data diadvam damyata.
Yo, this guy's wicked smart.
Translated from Sanskrit, we must give, sympathize, and control. This is how we can leave the wasteland, can heal the kingdom. And at the very least, by holding close to these ideals, we can set our own lands in order. We can shore some fragments against the ruins.
I sat upon the shore, fishing, with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order?
So I love this poem. I loved reading it and hearing what the professor had to say. I think it hit me at the right time in my life, and it's just one of those things that pops into my mind every few weeks. Data diadvam damyata. In general, I just think they're really good words to live by, and there's something so pleasing and elegant in their message. What's more, and I know this is kind of personal, but the wasteland reminds me of my dad, who died around 6 months ago. Not just because my dad loved T.S. Eliot when he was around my age, and loved pretentious stuff, and loved talking about archetypes, but also because I don't think he was a particularly happy man. I don't want to get too deep into this stuff, and I don't want to present you some biased image of my father, but he was generally pretty invested in his problems, in his discomfort and social anxiety, in his feeling that the world was pitted against him. What's more, he put a lot of stock in the idea that he could find some big solution to those problems. He was very invested in Buddhism and psychoanalysis and self-help books. And so, after he died, I almost immediately began to connect his life to the story of the Fisher King. To me, it seemed that, like the Fisher King, my father was injured, that his world was injured because of it, and that he was on a quest to find the words that would heal him. And I wondered, what would have been the right words for him? What would have healed his kingdom? And maybe Eliot was right. Maybe what my father needed to hear and listen to was as simple as give, sympathize, control. I don't know. So why did I start off this video with this incredibly long and annoying intro? Well, it's because I wanted to explain why, on some level, I'm attached to this stuff. This language was useful to me in my life, and it reminds me of my dad. And the reason that's important is that if it turns out that the ideology of the wasteland doesn't work, if there's something in it that we can't accept, if we can't look to it for all of our answers, then there's something to mourn here, right? And maybe I'm the only one who feels that way, but something tells me I'm not. Anyway, over the last few months, I've watched a lot of videos by Jordan Peterson, and this is a story about that. There's a really interesting video by Jordan Peterson that we'll be kind of focusing on today. A 2-hour lecture uploaded on his channel called Identity Politics and the Neo-Marxist Lie of White Privilege. And the first important thing I want to point out about this lecture is that Jordan Peterson doesn't provide any kind of real argument against the existence of white privilege. Doesn't ever work to prove that it's a lie. I mean, sure, he says a few words about how there are tons of factors that predict success in America and that race isn't the only one.
I can't quite figure out why the postmodernists have made the canonical distinctions they've made. Race, ethnicity, sexual proclivity, sexual gender identity.
So the core of Marxist theory is that nobody really deserves anything. That it's just some happy coincidence of life that people are where they are, and that society is not a meritocracy, but rather we're all born in the state of tabula rasa, and that events unfold. Material conditions determine what's going to happen. So this completely ignores the role of biology, the fact that some people are just more driven than others. This is because Marxist is a collectivist viewpoint. That is, we're not viewed as individuals, but members of a collective. So to Marxists, society is the history of class conflict, and the role of individual action is secondary.
Let's say. Those are 4 dimensions along which people vary. But there's a very large number of dimensions along which people vary. Here's some ways people differ. Intelligence, temperament, geography, historical time. You live now and not 100 years ago. Attractiveness, that's a big one.
But, you know, that's a given, right? Nobody thinks that being black or white is the only thing that matters in a person's life. That's ridiculous. Instead, they believe that race is an unimportant factor in the way that a person will be treated in our society, and that is an unjust thing. Or at a few points, he suggests that the scholarship trying to prove that white privilege exists is inadequate. And this is, of course, the one thing he'd have to show to prove that white privilege is a lie, but he never really commits to that argument in a more robust way. He just, isolates a personal, intentionally non-data-driven perspective on white privilege and is like, wee-oo, I'm the science police, that's personal and not even data-driven, wee-oo, woo.
The original paper on white privilege wouldn't have received a passing grade for the hypothesis part of a undergraduate honors thesis. Not even close. There's no methodology at all. It was called White Privilege and Male Privilege. A personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies.
But he seems to outright ignore the amount of credible information we have on this subject that might be more compelling to him. What's wrong with the study indicating that black names on resumes are turned over far more often than white names are?
One of the problems with the left is this hyper-focus on victimization and victim and victimizer dynamics. This is a problem because it infantilizes groups, and it takes away from the importance of good decision making. Now, rather than this whole focus on white privilege, a more productive approach would be to look at government policies that are blatantly racist. Ultimately, you can't really do much about society. If an unconscious bias is going to make some people who are in charge of hiring somebody pass up on black looking names, there's not really a remedy for that. Or maybe there is, but it's a complicated fix, involving challenging the status quo, changing how people think. But when it comes to overtly racist policies that are hurting black families today, there are some very easy fixes. For example, Milton Friedman described the minimum wage as the most anti-Negro law in the books. And we saw, prior to the introduction of the minimum wage, black teenage unemployment was slightly lower than white teenage unemployment. After the minimum wage was introduced, black teenage unemployment skyrocketed. Why do we look at teenage unemployment? It's because teenagers are a good surrogate for low-skilled workers in particular, in general. And what opponents of the minimum wage laws predict is that the minimum wage is going to price low-skilled workers out of the marketplace. So this has a really devastating impact on black communities. What happens when you have these really high levels of unemployment? Well, people are going to turn, if they're denied legitimate economic opportunity, they're going to turn to illegitimate economic opportunity. So at the same time, you have the prohibition on drugs and the drug trade. Okay, so now here's a large subset of the population that can't find work, as evidenced by the teenage unemployment rates, that have these lucrative opportunities in the drug trade. And then what happens? They end up going to prison. They end up getting shot in disputes over territory. So the unemployment, or the minimum wage, and the prohibition on drugs, and especially the uneven way in which sentencing is handled for various drugs, as well as other factors that impact on sentencing, which aggravate the situation, leads to a modern epidemic in incarceration rates amongst African Americans. Likewise, the modern welfare state provides tremendous incentive towards the disintegration of the black family. So, if we want to do something, we should work to eliminate these policies, these policies that are actively destroying black lives, instead of simply complaining about white privilege without any real policy proposals that are going to make matters better.
Were the sample sizes just too small on that one? How about the historical and economic analysis claiming that property discrimination had a direct impact on the ability of black people to accrue wealth in America? How about the literally dozens of papers about how black people are treated unfairly on basically every level of the American justice system? Boop, 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 boop. And I could keep going here, but the important thing is Peterson never addresses any of this stuff. It's not that I disagree with his interpretation of this robust research, rather, he just doesn't make an argument about it in the first place. Probably the case he devotes most of his time to making is that white privilege and its postmodern ilk is the modern form of militant totalitarian communism. Basically, he thinks that in order to maintain the lie that communism could work after the horrors of Stalinism took its toll, academics who wanted to continue advocating for Marxism had to replace their discussion of class struggle with things like identity politics and intersectionality.
So much data on the catastrophic failures of communism had accrued that even the most intransigent of French intellectuals had to admit that the jig was up. But that's a problem because that's the whole ideology. You're going to just give that up? What are you going to do after that? Well, what happened was postmodernism was invented. And so it's a sleight of hand, as far as I can tell. So
there's actually two strategic tracks taken by Marxists today. The first is what Peterson's talking about, cultural Marxism, where they aim towards the disintegration of the family unit, the destruction of traditional morals, the breakdown of Western society through advocating for deviant hedonistic lifestyles. And the second is Fabian socialism, which is incrementalism, rather than taking the revolutionary approach and trying to nationalize every industry at the same time. They try to achieve victory at the ballot box through the nationalization of one industry at a time, building inexorably towards the total socialist state, but at the same time giving plausible deniability on the behalf of social democratic politicians. You say, no, we're not socialists, we're democratic socialists. We just want free nanny care for everybody and free dental care. I mean, how can you be against that? You don't want poor people to have free trips to the dentist? You're a monster. But the end goal is still socialism.
And with postmodernism, identity politics.
And while I don't think his thesis here is strong at all, while I actually think it's deeply misleading, we can see that it doesn't much matter here, right? Because even if he's absolutely right about the history of terms like intersectionality and white privilege, that's still not an argument against those ideas. If systemic racism does exist, and to be clear, it does, then it exists. And it doesn't really matter if the people talking about it are trying to pull some strange Marxist bait and switch. Concepts aren't true or untrue based upon the supposedly shifty ideologues who say them. Now, I could give a few more examples here, but I think you see the point. And I sincerely hope you believe me when I say that I'm not ignoring the secret, real argument that Jordan Peterson makes in order to make my own narrative stronger. There would be no point to that. I'm not really invested in shaming the guy in the first place. No, what I want to do is ask a question. Why does it not matter that Jordan Peterson never makes a real argument against white privilege? Why is his lecture nonetheless kind of captivating? Why is the audience eating out of the palm of his hand, likely to agree with him about this topic? And this is, broadly speaking, the question that I'll be spending the rest of this video exploring. And to do that, let's return to the wasteland. I don't think it should take long to convince you that Jordan Peterson essentially wants to be a modern T.S. Eliot. It sounds weird, but it's not all that surprising. Eliot himself was pretty far on the right, even calling himself a royalist. Like Eliot, Peterson believes that the world is losing its grasp on what really matters.
We don't have much respect for tradition in the West, and it's a really, really big problem because the ethical responsibility of a human being is to take the dead culture, so that's the dead father or the dead God, and to revivify it with attention and communication.
And like Eliot, Peterson comes to the conclusion that our response to this must be to take that meaning back in a very personal way, regain an appreciation for the traditional and healthy modes of being, assume
There's a lot to be said for Western culture. Even today, the vast majority of individuals in the world are not free. Historically, freedom has been an extreme rarity. So absolutely, there is a lot to be said for traditional Western values, Judeo-Christian values, as expanded upon by the classical liberals, as codified into law, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. And cultural Marxism is a direct attack on these values, on this belief system. Well, anybody who challenges this encroachment on the traditional belief system is labeled a reactionary, is canceled or silenced or attacked. The fundamental problem is that people born in the West have no appreciation for the sacrifice and the hard work of our forefathers that allowed us to live in the standards of luxury that we enjoy today. They just assume because they were born into this lifestyle that it's natural, that it should always be and always will be. But in reality, it's the product of bitter sacrifice and hard work, tears, toil, and pain.
Sit up straight, clean your room. At their core, Jordan Peterson's politics are a politics of psychology. To him, we are all fisher kings, and by far the most important thing we can do is to heal ourselves, set our houses in order.
In the play The Cocktail Party by American English poet T.S. Eliot, one of the characters is having a very hard time of it. She speaks of her profound unhappiness to her psychiatrist. She tells him that she hopes her suffering is all her own fault. Taken aback, the psychiatrist asks why. Because, she tells him, if it's her fault, she can do something about it. If it's in the nature of the world, however, she's doomed. She can't change everything else, but she could change herself.
We can see this idea come through clearly in a video called I've Read Some Marx and Now I'm Gonna Change the World. In it, a student interviewer basically asks Peterson if he thinks activism is a good thing. And Peterson reacts to this question with a mix of skepticism and derision.
You know, you go out there with a stick and a sign on it that says, I'm against poverty. It's like, yeah, no kidding, man. Really. Like, who's for poverty? No one's for poverty. So it's an abdication of responsibility with the mask of social virtue.
Seemingly, the vast majority of activists are inauthentic and silly. They use gauche and overly public stances as a way to virtue signal to their friends and avoid the bigger problems in their lives.
You want to solve a difficult problem is you figure out how to get along with your brother, the one you've been fighting with for 5 years, or see if you can staple your family back together. See if you can stop fighting with your girlfriend and have a relationship that lasts for more than 2 weeks.
What's more, most of these people aren't meaningfully helping anyway. While he's not opposed to civil action outright, he thinks that we shouldn't tamper with the functioning of the world until we are competent enough to do so. And competence is a surprisingly restrictive quality to Peterson.
And they're usually people, well, they've had a successful relationship, they've had a successful family, they have a couple of degrees, they've established a business, like they've made themselves credible in 5 or 6 dimensions. Well, then maybe you know enough about the world to dare to mess with its internal mechanisms. And if you don't have that kind of in-depth knowledge, then you should no more work on the economic systems of Western civilization than you should try to adjust the electronic systems of your automobile.
And this idea crops up over and over again in Peterson's work. Like, say what you want about the guy, he does not hide the high premium he places on personal psychology or the disdain he has for people who look to the problems of society. It's something any fan of his would immediately recognize. And looking at this, considering the fact that I am probably the sort of person that Jordan Peterson is expressing a distaste for, it only makes sense that he made me think about my own psychology, about what I'm doing here. See, I've always wanted to work with media, either making it or talking about it. I just love the stuff and have since I was a kid. And I like to think that now that I've had this amazing opportunity to make these videos, that I've been a fairly decent person about it, that I've had integrity. I've never said something I don't believe to be true. I've never intentionally mischaracterized somebody. You know, stuff like that. But still, are my motives pure? Does my work come from some perfect, healthy, helpful place? Well, no, I don't think so. I like attention, plain and simple. I like getting money for being creative. I like feeling smart and correct about things, assembling an in-group of people who agree with me. And I'm not qualified to be that kind of person, right? I don't have multiple degrees. I'm not a policy expert. Nobody asked me to give my opinions when I first started. I volunteered them. At the end of the day, I love making videos, but it is a constant source of insecurity in my life. One defined both by the unending desire.
This brings to mind a quote from Murray Rothbard. It is no crime to be ignorant of economics, which is, after all, a specialized discipline, and one that most people consider to be a dismal science. But it is totally irresponsible to have a loud and vociferous opinion on economic subjects while remaining in this state of ignorance. And it's extremely common today for people that have really little to no understanding of economics to espouse economic policy on the basis of that it feels right to them, even though they have no idea what the long-term consequences of the policies they're espousing may be.
And by the realization that nothing makes me fit to this task, that there's no big reason I should be doing it. This is, I think, the power of Jordan Peterson. His ability to confront me, and I imagine much of his audience, with their own sense of angst and inner longing. The realization that there is an absence inside of us, one that takes up so much of our lives, and that reminds us that we are not good, not pure, not well-intentioned in some idealized way. And we won't find our answers to these problems in the issues of society, right? There is no policy change, no activism, no socialist utopia that's gonna get us out of this wasteland. So why look to those issues in the first place? Now, I don't think it should surprise you that ultimately I can't live thinking this way. I find it completely inadequate, and there's lots of arguments I could make to try to convince you that I'm right about that. Sure, I can agree that most people are broken and incompetent in one way or another, but I don't think that's a good reason to suggest that we not engage in politics and activism until we have solved those personal problems. After all, this is the fundamental cornerstone of democracy, either direct or indirect.
And that's the failing of democracy, that everybody's voice is equal regardless of if you're well read on the subject or if you've never read a book on the subject. That's why I greatly prefer the marketplace as a means of organizing society to the state. In the marketplace, people back up their words with action. An entrepreneur analyzes the situation, forecasts consumer demand in a certain way, and then risks their money and their time producing a good that people want to buy, that they think people will want to buy. Democracy is just mob rule. It's placating who's ever the loudest, who's ever organized the most. But it has nothing to do with justice or morality or even the good of society. It's just placating the majority, or at least the plurality that organizes. And what does the majority want? Free stuff. Free stuff from the government. I mean, that's what wins every election. Whichever politician can do a better Santa Claus impression and say, oh, I'm going to give you this and give you this and give you this. But the government has nothing but what they take from somebody else. Democracy isn't, as Churchill said, the worst form of government except all the rest. What democracy is a scam. It's a way of legitimizing the criminal state. There's a much better alternative, by the way, which is limited government. In the 19th century, government was extremely limited, and this wasn't the case before then. Okay, so starting in the 14th century, you had the rise of absolutism, where the king was all powerful. He could regulate, he could tax, he could control the whole kingdom. And then And then this was very bad, and many people opposed it. These people were called liberals, and they wrote against this whole system, and they brought about the dawn of liberalism, which was an era of individual liberty and limited government and freedom and prosperity like the world had never known. But during the 20th century, people abandoned that in favor of socialism and welfarism and interventionism. And the state grew in size tremendously until we have the omnipotent state of today. Democracy is really just a soft form of communism. The idea that nobody really owns anything. It all belongs to the community. And the state should dictate to us. You know, when the government taxes your labor, what they're really saying is that they own your labor and they allow you to keep a percentage of the proceeds. The modern state has monopolized many vital industries and controls everything that goes on in society through regulation, through taxation. Democracy is, as Hoppe put it, a god which has failed.
Have an active voice in the way that power operates. And I don't think that democracy is good because people are good, because they always know the best course of action we should take. No, I think it's good because I don't trust anybody else to handle that power better.
So, the market economy is just tremendously better than the state. You see, every interaction in the market economy is win-win. There's no issue of abuse of power because all interactions are voluntary. So if your employer isn't treating you fairly, then you can quit. Now, it may be that you can't find any better jobs, but then that just means that your employer is the best shot available to you. The best of a series of bad choices, you might say. But they're still providing you that best choice. So you're still benefiting by engaging, by trading your labor for their money, because they're offering you a better deal than anybody else. Likewise, you go to a store, you trade them your money, they give you the product. It's a mutually beneficial exchange. And that's true of every interaction in the market economy. The totality of the sums of trillions of trades every year involving individuals around the world. So no matter how big or powerful a corporation might seem, ultimately they're responsive to the consumer. They must produce what a consumer wants to buy, or they'll simply go out of business. That is the fundamental feature of the market economy, is that it's all based on voluntary interactions. And so it doesn't matter how big or how rich a corporation is, they still have to serve consumers if they want to stay in business. Now, the state is categorically different because the state has a monopoly on the initiation of force. They can take what belongs to another without their consent. They can plunder, and they can institute laws that benefit one group at the expense of another. Virtually any government intervention in the economy is going to do that. A tariff is going to benefit domestic producers at the expense of consumers. A minimum wage law is going to benefit skilled workers at the expense of unskilled workers. Licensure will benefit people who have licenses at the expense of those who don't. Taxes will benefit the net tax recipient at the expense of the net taxpayer. So with the state, interactions are win-lose. And this is why the power of the state is a very dangerous thing. And this is why democracy is a very bad idea, because it aggrandizes the power of the state by offering it this veil of legitimacy. But what's much better than that is the system that was in place in the 19th century, where you had very limited government, and instead everything else was just the purview of the marketplace. Because then, as I said, interactions are all mutually beneficial. It's just people working harmoniously together for the betterment of all. That's simply the nature of any interaction which is voluntary, of any system of production and exchange that is based entirely upon voluntary interaction.
Businessman with 5 degrees might be a good leader. I don't know him, but I'm not just gonna hitch my horse to his wagon because he's happy and has made a good life for himself. Rather, he needs to persuade me that he's gonna do the right things. And the only way he's gonna do that is if we both have political convictions that we care about and believe in, that we basically agree on what ought to be done. So I'm not saying that everybody's great or has to be a leader, but limiting civic engagement, concern, and activism to so-called competent people just doesn't work for me. Or sure, I could say, it seems like for a lot of us, our problems aren't caused by society, but by our own psychologies. But that's one of those unfalsifiable claims that sounds good on paper, but is really hard to make categorical statements about. And let's take the standard example here. A guy, let's call him Slobber, works at various retail jobs for 60 hours a week. He doesn't like what he does, and he doesn't make a lot doing it. Meanwhile, his marriage is falling apart. Lately, things have felt strained. He isn't as present as he used to be, and his wife is becoming increasingly unhappy about it. Now, just looking at this guy and his marriage, are there things he can do to make himself happier and make his relationship better? Well, of course there are. I'm not the ghoul of despair, here to take away Slobber's hopes from him, and I believe there are probably a number of things he can do to make his marriage better. But that doesn't mean we can't ask broader questions about his situation. Like, is his lack of presence at home because of a deep psychological failing on his part? Or because he spends most of his life doing work that he finds torturous? Is his wife mad because he just doesn't have communication skills? Or does his lack of ability in this area come from the fact that he's constantly worried about paying the bills because his work pays next to nothing? See, Slobber should work on his life and marriage. I hope he does. But we don't need to confine our appraisal of his situation to that statement alone. His well-being is inextricably linked to the society around him, to the way that him and others like him are treated. And as such, if social problems exist, then solving them will help Slobber. Or I could say the obvious point that I've already alluded to, that even accepting that everything Jordan Peterson says is true, it's just not enough to change the way that facts work. If I say a fact about the world we live in, and you respond that I suck and my house isn't in order, well, you might be right about that, but it doesn't challenge anything that I said. And, that's the main thing I'm gonna need to hear to be convinced that I'm wrong. And look, I think those arguments are all pretty compelling, but here's the problem. In the scope of Jordan Peterson's analysis, they are rendered irrelevant, because each of them, in one way or another, requires an engagement with what I'll call, a term I personally coined right now, and that you can't steal, the sociological imagination. Our ability to situate ourselves, not just as individuals, but also as nodes in a complex society and culture. If we're going to talk about the importance of democracy, or about Slobber, or about the way that facts work, we first need to accept that
This guy is super long-winded.
stuff is important to our lives, that attending to it might give us something of value. But the central thrust of Peterson's work is to obfuscate that possibility space. And so, in a very real way, I'm left without a foot to stand on here. What's more, it's undeniable that Peterson's narrative is a deeply appealing one. For one thing, it just feels really good. Like, okay, it's painful to think that my problems are my own, that the only thing standing in my way is my own failings. But it's painful in the good way, like hydrogen peroxide on a scraped knee. When you're a 24-year-old white straight guy who's incredibly online, there's worse things to hear than "you suck and you can make your life better by doing good things."
You want to solve difficult problems, you figure out how to get along with your brother, the one you've been fighting with for 5 years. Or see if you can staple your family back together. See if you can stop fighting with your girlfriend and have a relationship that lasts for more than 2 weeks.
It's certainly true in my case, and so reducing all of society to that conclusion has a pleasant and intuitive logic to it. But maybe more importantly, Jordan Peterson here is giving us one of the most priceless things imaginable: the gift of social apathy, the capacity to think and say rational things, but to not really care where that rationality might lead us. Obviously, climate change is a substantial global threat that we should work to ameliorate. Obviously. But if you're talking about it and you're not an expert, you're probably using this pseudo-moralistic stance to avoid other more
Is it though? Is climate change an existential threat? I mean, we've seen so far with 1.5 degrees warming since industrialization, basically nothing's happened. There's deaths from so-called climate disasters have been decreasing every year. Sure, the glaciers are melting, but we know that there were periods of time when there were no glaciers on the planet at all. Many countries like Canada and Russia stand to benefit from global warming. I think Peterson's fundamental message is we should better ourselves. You know, we should read. We should explore our own positions. We should do a critical examination of our own belief systems instead of just marching on the street when in reality it might be a not so nuanced viewpoint of the world that we hold.
Personal problems, an all-important observation to Jordan Peterson.
The climate, the global warming problem on the climate is something that needs to be tackled quickly, and they can't wait until they grow up and become prime ministers to do it. Do you think collective responsibility overrides individual responsibility in a huge issue like that?
No.
Okay.
I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors.
Or, obviously, the gays should be able to get married, but not if the whiners are talking about it.
Australia is holding a plebiscite on whether to legalize gay marriage. I'm against the Yes campaign, but only because it's backed by cultural Marxists. I'm curious to hear your views on gay marriage. Well, I would be against it too if it was backed by cultural Marxists, because it isn't clear to me that it will satisfy the ever-increasing, what would you call it, demand for an assault on traditional modes of being. Now, with regards to gay marriage specifically, that's a really tough one for me, because if the marital vows are taken seriously, then it seems to me that it's a means whereby gay people can be integrated more thoroughly into standard society, and that's probably a good thing.
They're trying to uproot the traditional social roles that help me in some abstract way. And since postmodernists won't be happy even if they get what they want, and since I don't actually care about society treating gay people fairly and equitably, screw them. The gays can get what they want. That's fine. But is it too much to ask that they want it for the reasons that I tell them to?
But is it really such a big deal if you can't get married? I mean, at the end of the day, how does that make you any worse off? Really, the government shouldn't be involved in marriage in the first place. It should be up to, the individuals and the church or whatever. If they want to do it civilly, that's another story. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with gay marriage, but I do think it's important to challenge the cultural Marxist agenda. So they might be right on. So cultural Marxists aren't necessarily going to advance only ideas that are wrong. So they might be right on this one issue. In which case, whatever, you can support gay marriage, but you have to keep an eye on the broader cultural Marxist agenda and the assault on traditional Judeo-Christian values.
Is it too much to ask that they stay in their fucking lanes? And finally returning to his 2-hour lecture, obviously Jordan Peterson doesn't have a real argument against the existence of white privilege. To have one of those, he'd have to examine about 1 million credible sources and come to the rigorous conclusion.
To all of this stuff, it's the bullshit non-issues that the left and the right obsess over. Stuff that really makes no difference at the end of the day. When in reality, it's economic policy, it's fiscal policy, monetary policy, foreign policy. These are the things that matter. But that's not what anybody talks about. That's not what anybody cares about. It's all these pointless social divisions that appeal to people's prejudices and their emotions.
Wrong. So instead of doing that, he'll cede at some point that racism probably does exist.
It's like racism. People are kind of racist. Or maybe people prefer their in-group. It's not that easy. Or maybe people prefer the familiar to the novel.
But we all have privileges, don't we? And the impact of systemic racism isn't total, is it? And besides, that whole concept comes from people who advocate for a communist dictator, who hate the idea that individuals are important and complicated and should be treated with care. Prove that he's wrong on that one, or don't. It couldn't matter less. Jordan Peterson doesn't have to prove that white privilege is a lie because it is an assumption baked into the fabric of his work. If white privilege does exist, if people's lives and identities are informed by grand systems that are sometimes very unjust, then there is a world to care about that goes far beyond our own suffering and sadness and chaos. And we can't or don't want to think that, so it must all be a Marxist lie. I'm not going to pretend to be an authority on anything. I'm not your boss. I don't have an inroad to your soul, and frankly, I'm not trying to get one. So instead of asking you to renounce the work of Jordan Peterson and embrace me instead, I want to close this video by talking about one moment that I found really striking. Toward the middle of his lecture, Jordan Peterson invokes a passage of George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, where he describes an impoverished woman working in the mining industry.
I had time to see everything about her. Her sack apron, her clumsy clogs, her arms reddened by the cold. She looked up as the train passed, and I was almost near enough to catch her eye. She had a round, pale face, the usual exhausted face of the slum girl who's 25 and looks 40 thanks to miscarriages and drudgery, and it wore, for the second in which I saw it, the most desolate, hopeless expression I've ever seen. It struck me then that we, meaning the middle class at that time, are mistaken when we say that it isn't the same for them as it would be for us, and that people bred in the slums can imagine nothing but the slums. For what I saw in her face was by no means the ignorant suffering of an animal. She knew well enough what was happening to her, understood as well as I did how dreadful a destiny it was to be kneeling there in the bitter cold on the slimy stones of a slum backyard, poking a stick up a foul drain pipe.
This passage is so beautiful and sad, I think. This woman is suffering at the hands of a system that just doesn't care about her. And the most notable thing about her is that she understands that something's wrong here. We like to think that people in the slums can only imagine the slums, but this is not true. She is aware, perhaps innately aware, that this...
Yeah, poverty sucks. And all the more reason to embrace the economic model that has seen standards of living for everyone, including the poor, skyrocket faster than any other economic system. Laissez-faire.
Her life is not okay. And Jordan Peterson goes on to say the acceptable things for a moment. How can we not want to help this woman? How can we not have compassion?
You have to have a heart of stone if you read that and you don't think, man, something should be done about this. It's really awful.
But after that, Peterson skips forward in the book and quotes George Orwell expressing his distaste for academic socialism, how he thinks they hate the rich more than they love the poor.
It would be a mistake to regard the book-trained socialist as a bloodless creature entirely incapable of emotion. Though seldom giving much evidence of affection for the exploited, he is perfectly capable of displaying hatred, sort of queer, theoretical, in vacuo hatred against the exploiters. Hence the grand old socialist sport of denouncing the bourgeoisie.
And you can agree with Orwell about this or not. I think his point is probably true to some extent, but it's not too important here. What is important to me about this moment is that this is the last we hear about this woman. He introduces her suffering, talks about how hard her life was, and then he talks about how the people advocating for her life to be better are bad and shouldn't be trusted, and that's it. No more time.
But that's not what socialists are advocating for. Socialists are advocating for control over society by the state. And sure, they'll tell you nowadays, since the failure of state socialism is so obvious, they're advocating for control over the means of production by the workers. But that's actually a much less tenable system. I mean, libertarian socialism would collapse within 2 generations to subsistence agriculture, because it doesn't even make an attempt to solve the calculation problem, which is, absent a price system, how do you determine how to allocate scarce resources in capital goods industries? There's no central body, no governing organization. You simply have workers working their means of production as they want, producing what they want, doing with it what they want. There's no attempt to coordinate the activities of society. It's just an absurd system.
Talk of compassion or of redistribution. Now we've made our points about her, and we can get on to the second half of the lecture, where we talk about how activists are shitty and lying about racism somehow, where we can recycle the same tired line about how we shouldn't give protesters too much credit and get the same facile laugh from the audience.
I'm against poverty. You know, that's like classic protest sign. It's like, really? It's like, I'm against torture. It's like, it's so obvious. You don't get any brownie points for being against poverty. No one in their right mind is for poverty.
Because to Jordan Peterson, relinquishing brownie points from some hypothetical activists protesting poverty will always be more important than the poverty they protest. No. Within the story of this lecture, the woman's plot is left dangling. In essence, she's still standing there in that coal mining town in northern England. And you can almost picture Jordan Peterson reading by a lamp that her work helped to fuel. You can imagine him reading the words, Data Diadvam Damyata, give, sympathize, control. And maybe Peterson is comforted by those words, but I don't know if I can be anymore. So...
Yeah, this guy's big on the flowering metaphors and very weak on the solutions.